Charleston has a way of catching you off guard. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't need to. It seeps in through the eaves of old plantation houses, through the scent of magnolia drifting into every open window come September, through the uneven clatter of rolling suitcase wheels over centuries-old cobblestone. Charleston doesn't demand your attention. It simply extends an invitation, quiet and unhurried. And by the time you realize you've accepted it, you're already inside. Cristina Wilson understood this the moment the moving truck rounded the corner of East Bay Street, and she saw, for the first time, the building that was about to become her life. 4 stories, red brick aged by decades of salt air rolling in off the harbor, its surface rough and porous like the skin of something that had learned to survive. Tall windows framed by white wooden shutters, a narrow second-floor balcony dressed with wrought iron planters. The kind of place that, in any other city, would have cost twice what it cost here. But Charleston still kept secrets like that reserved for the people patient enough to look. She was 35 years old, freshly promoted to Federal Prosecutor, and entirely out of patience for anything resembling romanticism. She had built herself into someone who didn't need a hand to hold during transitions, who scheduled the movers 6 weeks in advance, who color-coded her moving boxes by room, who arrived in a new city the way she arrived in a courtroom, prepared, self-contained, giving nothing away. Women like Cristina didn't move to a new city and feel lonely. They moved and got to work. That was the agreement she had made with herself somewhere around her late 20s, and she had kept it without much difficulty. Until now, it had never felt like a loss. The move itself was efficient. 2 movers, 4 hours, 0 complications. Cristina hadn't brought much. A bed frame, the shelf of legal textbooks that had survived 3 previous apartments, like a stubborn old witness, and the potted plants she refused to let die, despite every rational argument against keeping them. Everything else was new furniture, functional, impersonal, without history. She preferred objects that didn't carry memory. Less weight to redistribute every time she packed up and started over. The building had 8 units. While the movers hauled boxes up the stairwell, she stood in the doorway and did what federal prosecutors do instinctively, she observed. The woman in 1B had an orange cat watching the commotion from the windowsill with the grave authority of a sitting judge. The couple in 2A argued in low, careful voices about where to hang a painting. A young woman from 3B descended the stairs wearing headphones, gave Cristina a single nod without breaking stride, and disappeared through the front door. Then the door to 2B opened. The hallway seemed to contract slightly, the way a room does when something shifts in it that you can't immediately name. Cristina couldn't explain afterward what made her look. Maybe it was the sound, not the quick, distracted swing of someone running late, but a deliberate, measured opening, like whoever stood on the other side had a specific relationship with pace and saw no reason to rush it. The man who stepped out was tall, dark hair a little long, curling just slightly at the nape of his neck, with that particular kind of dishevelment that either cost a fortune at the right salon or cost absolutely nothing because it was simply natural. And everything about him suggested the latter. Light brown skin, broad shoulders filling out a plain white t-shirt, black linen pants, no jewelry, no watch, no visible effort. He registered the moving chaos with the calm of someone who had seen it before and felt no compulsion to narrate it. He nodded at the movers as he passed. He descended the stairs without hurry. He didn't look at Cristina. She looked at him. Neighbor, she catalogued internally, with the same flat clinical neutrality she applied to defendants, whose files she hadn't fully read yet. That night, while she unpacked boxes and debated where the bookshelf would live, she heard movement through the wall. Not from above, from beside her. Apartment 2B. An irregular rhythm, unhurried, like someone mapping the dimensions of a room by living inside it rather than measuring it. Cristina crossed to the window. The lights in 2B were on. In the dark reflection of the window across the narrow courtyard, she could make out a silhouette, dancing, slow, deliberate, arms moving through the amber light like he was conducting something only he could hear, alone in the middle of a room lit by a single overhead lamp. She stood there longer than she intended to. Her hand rested on the cold window pane without her noticing. Neighbor, she thought again. The word sat differently this time, though she couldn't have said exactly why. 2 days later, climbing the stairs with 2 grocery bags and her phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, her assistant running through the pending details of a new federal case that had landed on her desk that morning. She found the woman from 1B waiting in the corridor. White hair immaculate. Floral apron, the orange cat draped across her arms like an accessory she'd chosen deliberately. "You must be the new girl in 2A, the woman said, her Charleston drawl long and unhurried, the accent of someone born here who had no intention of sounding otherwise. "I'm Sandra. Anything you need, you knock on my door." "Cristina," she ended the call, still getting settled. "I know how that goes." Sandra fell into step beside her on the stairs. "It's a wonderful building. You'll love it here. Everyone's very considerate." A deliberate pause, the kind that signals a person saving the best item for last. "Have you met your neighbor yet, Patrick?" "Briefly." Cristina shifted the grocery bags. "Just in passing." Sandra's face arranged itself into an expression that lived somewhere between genuine warmth and barely contained gossip. "Handsome, isn't he?" She dropped her voice, though the hallway was empty. "Poor thing. He's gay, you know. But so polite, never makes noise, always offers to help when something needs doing. We just adore him." The cat blinked at Cristina with slow, amber indifference. Cristina looked at the door to 2B. "Ah," she said, because the conversation hadn't left room for anything more substantial. Sandra meant well. Cristina could see that clearly enough. But there was something exhausting about the human instinct to file people away before you'd even learned their last name. To stamp a label on someone's door before they'd had the chance to open it themselves. She had prosecuted enough cases to know that the stories people told about each other were almost never the whole story. Sometimes they weren't even close. Sandra kept talking, but Cristina had stopped tracking the words. She was thinking about the silhouette moving through lamplight. The way he had stood 2 feet away in that hallway, without crowding her, without performing accessibility, without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. The economy of him, how he seemed to occupy exactly as much space as he needed, and not an inch more. She didn't know what he was, and she was increasingly certain that nobody in this building did either. That night she slept poorly. She lay on her back in the new apartment dark, listening to the building breathe around her, the groan of the pipes, the distant rhythm of the city outside, and the silence from the apartment beside hers, which somehow felt louder than noise. She couldn't have explained why. The first real conversation between them happened because of an elevator and a box that was simply too large for one person to manage gracefully. Cristina had gone down to the garage to retrieve the last item she'd left behind, a file box from her previous office, heavy enough that she regretted the decision somewhere around the second step of her return trip. The elevator doors opened at garage level, at the exact moment she was attempting to balance the box against her knees while trying to hit the call button with her elbow. It wasn't working. "Can I help?" The voice came from behind her. Low, unhurried, with none of that performative brightness people attach to offers they're not sure will be accepted. She turned. Patrick Pompeo stood 2 feet away, car keys in hand, looking at the box with a completely neutral expression. No pity, no condescension, just the face of someone who had identified a problem and happened to have the obvious solution standing right there with him. "I've got it," she said, reflex. "I know." He didn't move. "It'll just take longer." There it was, the particular exhaustion of being a woman who had spent a decade proving she didn't need assistance, until the proving itself became its own kind of burden. She knew how to carry heavy things alone. She had made a point of knowing. But sometimes the point cost more energy than the thing itself, and the elevator wasn't getting any closer, and he was simply standing there, not performing patience, just waiting. She looked at the box. She looked at the button. She looked at him. "Second floor," she said. He picked up the box as though it weighed nothing, and he didn't make a production of it. No exaggerated breath, no adjusted grip, none of that theater some men perform to ensure you register how much they're carrying on your behalf. He stepped into the elevator, waited for her to follow, and pressed 2. The elevator was small. One of those original cage door models, the kind you don't find in modern buildings anywhere, but which Charleston maintains as though they are protected monuments, which technically they were. The metal gate rattled shut with a sound like something being decided. 30 seconds up. She counted. "You're the new one in 2A, he said, not a question. "Yes, Cristina." He nodded. No reciprocal introduction. She already knew his name from Sandra, Patrick, but she held it back and waited. He didn't offer it. The elevator stopped. He carried the box out, waited for her to indicate which door, set it down in the hallway with deliberate care, and took one step back. "Thank you," she said. "No problem." He turned toward his own door. "Patrick." He stopped. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd said it. A confirmation, maybe, or a small act of calibration, a way of establishing that she already knew who he was, that the information in the room was distributed evenly. He turned back with an expression she couldn't quite file away. It wasn't surprise. It was something quieter than that, something that lived closer to recognition. "Sandra," he said, as though that were a complete and sufficient answer. Cristina laughed. It was involuntary, a short, genuine exhale that escaped before she could catch it. Patrick Pompeo did not laugh. But something happened at the corners of his mouth, not a smile, the architecture of one. The frame going up before whoever was building it decided not to finish. Then he turned, stepped into his apartment, and closed the door. There is a specific quality that certain people carry, a kind of presence that neither requests anything nor promises anything, that gives exactly what is necessary and holds the rest in reserve. Not coldness. Something more deliberate than that. The presence of someone who learned at some point and at some cost that giving too much always comes with a bill attached. Cristina didn't have a name for it yet, but she felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not consciously, not immediately, but somewhere in the body before the mind catches up. She went inside with the box, closed the door behind her, and stood with her back against it for just a moment. The hallway was silent. She crossed to the shelf, began unpacking the files, and moved on with her afternoon. But the question stayed, lodged in the back of her mind like a piece of music she couldn't identify, a single phrase on a loop, sourceless and persistent. He said my name without me ever telling him who I was. Over the following days, they crossed paths 3 times, once on the stairs, twice at the building entrance. Each time, he offered that particular nod of his, the one that registered neither indifference nor invitation. She returned it. Neither of them stretched it into anything more. The neighbors, however, were happy to stretch things on their behalf. Jorge from 3A, 30, tech startup, a working opinion on everything, stopped her at the mailboxes Thursday afternoon. "You've met Patrick yet? Crossed paths a few times. Great guy." Jorge flipped through his mail without looking at it. "Gay, but great guy." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me that?" Jorge blinked, briefly derailed by the question. "Just giving you context, so you know going in." "Context," she repeated, in the tone she reserved for witnesses who said something that didn't hold up under its own weight. He laughed, slightly uncomfortable, and changed the subject. She had noticed in her years as a prosecutor that people rarely understood the difference between being helpful and being invasive, mostly because the feeling from the inside was identical. You thought you were handing someone a useful piece of information. You thought you were being generous with your knowledge. It almost never occurred to you that the person on the other end might experience it as a quiet reduction of someone they hadn't yet had the chance to fully see. On the drive to work, she found herself counting. 3 people. Less than 1 week. 3 separate, unprompted disclosures about the sexual orientation of a man she had exchanged fewer than 20 words with, offered up like a warning label, like a footnote, like something she was supposed to factor into every future interaction. She thought about the Patrick she had actually encountered, the unhurried voice, the effortless lift, the door closing without ceremony. These people have never really looked at him, she thought. Have they? Then she put it down because she had a federal case to build and couldn't afford to spend her cognitive resources analyzing the social architecture of a building she'd lived in for less than 2 weeks. That afternoon when she got home, there was a flower on her doormat, a single stem of lavender, no note, no ribbon, no gesture toward explanation, just the stem lying there against the worn welcome mat, as though it had always meant to end up exactly there. except that lavender doesn't fall from anywhere on its own. Cristina stood in the hallway and looked at it for a long moment. The building was quiet around her. Down the hall, the stripe of light under the door to 2B was steady and still. She picked up the stem, went inside and set it in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill. She didn't walk to 2B and knock, but she stood at that window longer than she needed to, watching the last of the afternoon light move slowly across the lavender's pale purple, the glass casting a thin shadow across the sill, until the kitchen went gold and then grey and the city outside settled into evening. The case arrived on a Monday morning and consumed everything. Not an ordinary case. The kind that surfaces once a decade, a corruption network threading through 3 South Carolina counties, implicating recognizable names, carrying enough documented evidence to make it genuinely dangerous. Cristina's desk became a map of connections. Her phone stopped being quiet. The office filled with that specific electrical charge that only major cases generate, equal parts urgency and carefully calibrated fear. She loved it. She always had. There is a particular kind of woman who discovers early that work doesn't disappoint the way people do, that a well-constructed case doesn't leave in the morning without explanation, that a just sentence doesn't change its mind at the last hour. A career built on that understanding isn't an escape. It's a choice, and the distinction matters more than most people are willing to admit. Cristina Wilson had made that choice with both eyes open, and she had never once looked back at it with regret. Only occasionally, in the quietest moments, did she notice the shape of what the choice had cost her, and even then, she filed it away and moved on. For 2 weeks, she barely saw Patrick. Their schedules didn't align. She left early, returned late, ate standing over the kitchen sink at 11 at night. When she crossed paths with any neighbor, it was in passing, nothing more. Sandra stopped her on Wednesday of the 2nd week, armed with a tin of homemade cookies and the inevitable building update. "Have you seen Patrick lately?" the older woman asked, in the tone of someone who poses a question without needing the answer because she's already written her own version of it. "Briefly," Cristina said. "Poor thing. He stays in so much, you know." Sandra paused with practiced timing. "But that's just his way. Gay men are like that, very homebodied, very gentle, very—" "Sandra." Cristina interrupted her quietly. "Do you actually know that he's gay?" The woman blinked. "Well, he's never brought home a girlfriend. He's very refined, very polite. He dances, you know." She said it the way people cite evidence they believe is self-explanatory, as though the word dances closed the argument entirely. Cristina took a cookie. "Thank you for these." She had spent enough years in courtrooms to understand how people construct verdicts from the flimsiest of evidence, a posture, a preference, an absence of the expected. No girlfriend seen. Holds flowers with intention, dances alone. And somehow, from those 3 data points, an entire human being gets reduced to a category and filed away. The frightening part wasn't the conclusion. It was how completely satisfied people felt once they'd reached it. She climbed the stairs, cookie in hand, trying with limited success not to think about Patrick Pompeo. Gay. Very refined. Dances. She thought about the size of his hands wrapped around that file box, the way he had stood 2 feet away without crowding her, simply waiting. The voice that carried none of that performative accessibility certain men layer on when they want to seem approachable. She didn't know what he was. She knew that nobody in this building did either. On Saturday, she went to the neighborhood market, the old kind, open air with stalls of fresh produce and the smell of warm spice that made Charleston feel distinct from every other city she'd lived in. She was scrolling through her phone and reaching for tomatoes when she heard his voice, not directed at her, at the flower vendor in the adjacent stall. Patrick stood with his back to her, examining stems with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. His shoulders were relaxed, unhurried, one hand turning a stem of lavender slowly in the morning light. He selected lavender, she recognized it immediately, along with branches of eucalyptus and a white flower she couldn't name from where she stood. For whom? The thought arrived before she could stop it. She stayed longer than necessary, making a performance of inspecting tomatoes she had already decided on, tracking him through her peripheral vision. Patrick paid, thanked the vendor by name. "Thanks, Earl," and turned. Their eyes met. He showed no surprise, just that familiar nod. "Cristina." "Patrick." She gestured, without thinking, toward the flowers. "For someone special." The question was out before she'd filtered it. She regretted it the instant it landed. But Patrick looked down at the flowers with an expression she couldn't decode, not offense, not amusement, something quieter than either, and said, "For the apartment." Then he moved on. She stood there with tomatoes in her hand, looking at the space he'd occupied a moment before, the market noise flowing around her like water around something fixed. For the apartment. That afternoon, arriving home, she found it on her doormat again, a single stem of lavender. This time there was a note, small, written in the hand of someone who doesn't put pen to paper often, the letters slightly uneven, deliberate, like each word had been considered before it was committed. "Welcome to the neighborhood." P. Just that. Cristina stood in the hallway and looked at the note for longer than she should have. Then she picked up the lavender, went inside, and placed it in the same glass as the first. 2 stems now, their pale purple heads leaning together slightly in the water, the kitchen holding the faint, clean scent of them, like a quiet secret. She didn't go to 2B and knock. But that night, for the first time in weeks, she didn't open her laptop after dinner. She sat on the balcony instead, her feet tucked beneath her, a glass of wine going warm in her hand, listening to the sounds of the old city settle into itself, the distant harbor, the cobblestone streets, the low murmur of a neighborhood that had been here long before her and would remain long after. And she thought about things that had nothing to do with the federal case she was building. She didn't examine what those things were. She just let them sit there, the way you let a song play when you don't know the name of it but aren't ready for the silence that would follow. It was on a Thursday evening that the case became something else entirely. Cristina was still at her desk when her assistant knocked with that particular expression, the one she had learned to read as news that needs to be received sitting down. It was nearly 8 o'clock. The hallway outside the Federal Prosecutor's office had gone quiet. "Talk to me," she said. "The primary witness, Marcus Holt." The assistant set a folder on her desk. He received a threat this afternoon, formal, documented, with a specific address. Cristina opened the folder, read it, read it again. The address was hers. The air in the room didn't change. The fluorescent light above her desk hummed the same indifferent hum. Outside the window, the city continued its Thursday evening without any awareness of what had just shifted inside that office. Not her work address, not the previous one. The apartment on East Bay Street, with the unit number, with the floor. Someone inside the network knew where she lived. She held the paper for approximately 30 seconds. That specific interval the mind requires to process, the moment a threat stops being abstract and acquires a street address, a door number, a physical location in the world where your body sleeps. Then she closed the folder. "Initiate the security protocol. I want an origin investigation opened right now." She stood, reached for her coat. "And contact the Witness Protection Department. I need a meeting first thing tomorrow." "And you?" her assistant asked. "I'm going home." The body knows before the mind does. The legs move faster than usual, and you only notice because the heel strikes the floor differently. More urgent, less measured, the careful control slightly offline. Cristina Wilson had built a career that moved faster than most, sharp enough at 26 to be noticed, deliberate enough at 30 to be feared, and precise enough now, at 35, to carry cases that senior colleagues quietly hoped would land on someone else's desk. She had a case record that made defense attorneys uneasy, and a composure that had held through depositions, through verdicts, through the kind of professional pressure that breaks people who are less deliberate than she is. But in the car, alone, the GPS mapping the route home to the address on that paper, her hands trembled on the steering wheel for exactly 8 seconds. She counted. Then they stopped. The apartment was dark when she arrived, silent. She turned on every light. Not out of fear, she told herself, out of practicality, and stood in the middle of the living room, uncertain what to do with her body. That was the problem. Cristina Wilson always knew what to do with her body. She put it to work, set it in motion, directed it toward the next logical step. But the next logical step here was to wait, and waiting was the one competency she had never developed, the one gap in an otherwise fortified interior. She went to the window. Charleston was out there, indifferent and beautiful, the harbor lights scattering across the water in long, trembling lines, the old streets running their same ancient routes, as though nothing in the world had changed this evening. The city didn't know. The city never knew. And then something gave way. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in films. No tears, no collapse onto the floor. Just the sudden physical recognition of the facts as they actually were. She was alone in a new apartment in a city she barely knew. Her home address was on a threat document, and there was no one to call. There was no one to call. She was out the door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. 3 knocks on 2B. Measured even. The knock of someone delivering a piece of misaddressed mail, as though the body understood that falling apart required a cover story. A pause. The door opened. Patrick stood in a faded grey t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly unsettled, still carrying the warmth of a recent shower. He was holding a book, a finger marking his place between the pages. He looked at her. He didn't say what's wrong. He didn't say, "Can I help?" He didn't say anything at all. He simply looked at her with that quality of complete attention he carried, as though the rest of the world had quietly stepped back to give the moment room. Cristina opened her mouth to say something reasonable, to manufacture a pretext, to ask a small and ordinary favor. Anything that made logical sense as a reason to be standing at a near stranger's door at 9 on a Thursday night. Nothing reasonable came out. What came out was, "I need to sit somewhere that isn't my apartment." Patrick stepped back from the door. She went in. His apartment was an exact mirror of hers in layout and entirely different in every other way. The walls held framed photographs of stage performances, black and white, precisely composed. Bodies caught mid-motion in the kind of suspension that only exists for a fraction of a second before it dissolves. A long shelf ran the length of one wall, dense with books, sheet music, and a handful of small figurines she didn't recognize. The living room held a deliberate emptiness at its center. No furniture, open floor, and she understood it immediately. The improvised studio. The space where the silhouette danced. A single floor lamp in the corner cast everything in amber. Patrick moved to the armchair by the window, the only armchair positioned beside a 2-seat sofa. He sat. He opened his book again, but didn't read. He waited. Cristina crossed to the sofa, sat, looked at her hands in her lap. And then, she would never fully understand the precise mechanism that produced what happened next, whether it was exhaustion or fear, or simply the weight of a moment that had run out of structure to hold itself upright. She stood, took 2 steps across the small space between them, and sat down in his lap. The room held its breath. It wasn't sensual, it wasn't planned. It was the most instinctive and disoriented thing she had done in years, the gesture of a child who is frightened and finds the nearest solid person and simply chooses them, without logic, without permission, without any of the careful calculation that governed every other decision in her life. Patrick didn't pull back. He didn't go rigid, didn't do any of the things a person does reflexively when the social contract gets rewritten without warning. He stayed exactly where he was, and then, slowly, he placed one hand against her back. Not an embrace, a hand, steady and still, the way you hold something fragile. Present without pressure, firm without force. Cristina closed her eyes. The silence did its work gradually. Her breathing found its own pace again. The tightness across her shoulders released by degrees, like a knot loosened not by pulling, but by patience. The apartment stopped feeling like a foreign place and became, strangely and without explanation, the safest room she had occupied in a very long time. Then he spoke, low, close to her ear. The words came slowly, with the care of someone who has learned that language can do damage when it moves too fast. "You don't have to be strong right now. I'm here." There are words that find you in the wrong order, that arrive after the years when you needed them most, when you had already built your entire architecture around their absence. Cristina Wilson had built a career that moved faster than most, sharp enough at 26 to be noticed, deliberate enough at 30 to be feared, and precise enough at 35 to carry cases that senior colleagues quietly hoped would land on someone else's desk. She had done all of it quickly, hungrily, with the focused intensity of someone who understood early that excellence was the one currency that didn't depreciate. But she had done all of it inside a particular silence. The silence of someone who learned early that needing people was a variable that introduced risk, and that the cleanest way to manage risk was to need less. She had become extraordinary at needing less. She had mistaken the skill for strength for so long that she'd forgotten there was a difference. No one, not one person in the entire architecture of her life, had ever said those words to her the way he said them, without invoice, without condition, without making the offering into a debt she would be expected to service later. She didn't answer. There was no answer for something like that. Some things can only be received. She stayed where she was until the trembling in her hands was gone completely, until her body believed, in the way bodies eventually must, that it was being held by someone who had no interest in letting go. She woke up on his sofa. For 1 second, that specific second before the brain finishes loading its context, she didn't know where she was. Then she saw the photographs on the walls. The floor lamp was off now, replaced by the grey morning light pressing through the white wooden shutters. It all came back. She sat up slowly. A blanket covered her that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. Patrick's book lay on the coffee table, the bookmark in a different position than the night before. He had read while she slept. He had stayed in that armchair, turned pages in the quiet, and let her rest without making it into anything that required acknowledgement. The kitchen smelled like coffee. Cristina sat still for a moment, listening to the apartment settle around her. Then she heard something else. Music, low but clear. Something instrumental she didn't recognize, contemporary. With that particular quality that isn't quite a film score, but carries the same sense of interiority, as though it had been composed for exactly this kind of early morning light. And then the sound of movement. She rose slowly and crossed to the entrance of the living room. Patrick stood at the center of the empty floor space. His back was to her, shirtless, grey sweatpants riding low. She noticed the absence of his shirt, the way you notice a change in temperature, not as a decision, just as information the body receives before the mind has a chance to classify it. Moving with the same precision she had watched through the window weeks ago, but now without glass between them, without distance, without mediation. The music found him and he found it back, the two things in quiet conversation. There is a fundamental difference between watching someone dance on a stage and watching someone dance when they believe they are alone. On a stage there is performance, the subtle awareness of being observed that modifies every gesture at its source, that adds a layer of intention between the body and its movement. But when someone moves without an audience, when the body acts only for itself, when no gesture is asked to convince anyone of anything, what you witness is something categorically different. It is what a person looks like when no one is asking them to be anything in particular, the self, unedited. Cristina Wilson stood in the doorway and watched Patrick Pompeo be exactly who he was. He moved slowly, then with sudden velocity, then stopped, testing something, she realized. Not a finished choreography, the process of building one, the rehearsal of an idea that didn't yet have its final shape, all the searching still visible in it. His back was... She tried to avoid the word that surfaced first, attempted to replace it with something more clinical, more neutral, more appropriate for a woman standing uninvited in a neighbor's living room at 7 in the morning. She couldn't manage it. Beautiful. The musculature shifted beneath his skin with each movement, the shoulder blades drawing together and releasing, the line of his spine a clean architecture from the nape of his neck downward, disappearing into grey cotton. She was aware, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, that she was looking, not glancing, not cataloguing, looking, the way you look at something that has bypassed your defenses entirely and arrived before you had the chance to decide whether to let it in. She told herself it was the dancer's body she was responding to, the discipline of it, the precision. She was a detail-oriented person by profession, trained to observe. This was simply observation. She almost believed it. Almost, until he shifted his weight and turned slightly, the amber morning light catching the curve of his shoulder, and something low and quiet moved through her that had nothing whatsoever to do with professional habit. She didn't move. She wasn't entirely sure she was breathing. She stayed longer than she'd intended, long enough for him to turn completely and find her there. Patrick stopped, not with a startle, with that clean transition he had, the simple shift from motion to stillness with nothing in between, as though his body had an off switch that the rest of him had learned to trust. They looked at each other for a moment that had no fixed duration. She became aware, suddenly and all at once, that she was standing in his apartment in yesterday's clothes, with sleep-soft hair and no prepared version of herself whatsoever. No composure assembled in advance. No courtroom posture. Just her, exactly as she was. Caught. And then Patrick Pompeo smiled. Not the architecture of a smile, the way it had been in the elevator, the real one, slow, arriving in his eyes several seconds before it reached his mouth, the kind you recognize immediately as genuine because it carries no effort, no performance, no awareness of itself at all. Cristina felt something give way inside her, not dramatically, silently. The way ice yields to temperature, not with a crack but with that soft, barely audible sound of a structure releasing what it has been holding against the warmth for too long. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and then she left. She didn't run. She walked, with the composure and appropriate velocity of someone who was absolutely, definitively not fleeing. Through the hallway into her own apartment, door closed behind her. She stood with her back against it for approximately 10 seconds. Sometimes the most desperate exit looks exactly like a composed one. The body performs calm while everything underneath it moves at a completely different speed. She knew this. She had prosecuted people who had done it. Walked out of rooms with their faces perfectly arranged, while their interior architecture came apart at the seams. She had always found it almost admirable in a clinical sort of way. She understood it considerably better now. She went and showered. She stayed under the hot water longer than necessary. She stood there with her palms flat against the tile and let the steam fill the small bathroom, and thought about the blanket that had appeared while she slept, about the coffee made quietly, without waking her, about the way the smile had arrived slowly, as though he didn't distribute them frequently and understood the specific weight of each one. She thought, briefly and against her better judgment, about the line of his spine in the morning light. Then she turned the water to cold. She thought about the words from the night before. "I'm here." She got out, dressed, and went to work. She tried not to think about it anymore. She made it approximately 23 minutes. 5 days passed without them seeing each other. Not by accident. Cristina had adjusted her schedule with a precision she recognized in her more honest moments as cowardice, but couldn't bring herself to correct. The federal case had escalated. Daily meetings with the Witness Protection Department, a full review of the evidence chain, a preliminary hearing set for the following month. The work had exactly the right volume to fill whatever space needed filling. She had always been good at that, finding the right amount of noise to place between herself and the things she wasn't ready to look at directly. On Wednesday evening, she saw the local news. She hadn't been looking for it. She was eating late, laptop open beside her plate, when the Chiron appeared. Federal Prosecutor leads historic municipal corruption investigation, with a photograph, with her name, with the address of her office. She turned off the volume. On the other side of the wall, Patrick's apartment was silent. She was aware of the silence in a way she wouldn't have been 2 weeks ago. Thursday morning, heading down to work, she found him in the building entrance. He was standing with his phone in one hand and a coffee in the other, and he looked up when she came down the last few steps, the first time they'd seen each other since the morning on his sofa. "I saw it," he said simply. She didn't need to ask what. "It's standard procedure," she said, in the tone she used to reassure junior staff. "Exposure comes with the territory." Patrick looked at her with that attention of his that never asked permission to be direct. "Are you okay?" The question landed differently than it should have. Not "how are you?" Not "I hope everything's all right." The honest version, the one that presupposes the answer might genuinely be no. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded, didn't push. "If you need," he said, and left the rest of the sentence open. She left. There is a particular generosity in the unfinished sentence, in the person who stops before the period, because they understand that you've already received everything the words were carrying. No completion required, no performance of the offer, just the space left open, like a door that doesn't need to be all the way ajar to tell you it isn't locked. The people who do this are rare. Cristina had met very few of them in 35 years, and she recognized each one the way you recognize a specific quality of light, not by naming it, but by the way it changes how everything around it looks. That afternoon, in the gap between two meetings, her assistant came in with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the face of bad news, but the face of something that didn't fit any existing category. "Do you know a Patrick Pompeo?" She looked up from her desk. "My neighbor." "Why?" "He came up in the background sweep the security system ran on your building's residents." The assistant set a single sheet on the desk. "I thought you should see it." Cristina picked it up. "Patrick Augusto Pompeo, 36 years old, Charleston, SC native, Bachelor of Fine Arts, the Juilliard School, New York City, professional career with contemporary dance companies in New York and Chicago. 12 years awards, critical recognition, and then 6 years ago, abrupt end of career. Return to Charleston." She moved her eyes down to the context note. Reason for return: care of father, terminal diagnosis, paternal death, 4 years prior. Subject remained in Charleston thereafter. She set the page down slowly, the way you set down something that has become heavier between your hands than it was when you picked it up. Juilliard. 12 years of a career built deliberately, brick by careful brick, in the cities where that kind of work actually existed, and he had walked away from all of it, the work, the city, the level of recognition, to come home to a dying father. And when the father died, he stayed. Not because Charleston had given him something equivalent to replace what he'd left behind. Not because the career had continued at a different scale in a different place. He had simply stayed, in the apartment with the empty floor at the center, with the photographs of other people's performances on the walls, dancing alone in the early morning to music no one else was awake to hear. There are moments when something you learn about a person shifts the entire angle of your understanding, not overturning what you knew before, but revealing it as incomplete. And incomplete, with certain people, lands harder than wrong. Wrong you can set aside. Incomplete stays with you, opens questions you hadn't thought to ask, makes you want to go back through every previous interaction and read it again with better information. Cristina sat looking at the folded page on her desk for a long moment. Then she picked up her coat, told her assistant she was leaving early and went home. She stopped at the market on the way, bought a bottle of wine, not the cheapest, not the most expensive, the one she reached for when she wanted something that deserved actual attention. The choice took her less than 30 seconds. She didn't examine why. She arrived at the building, climbed the stairs, stood in the corridor for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, looking at the two doors, 2A, which was hers, and 2B. She knocked on 2B, no prepared excuse, no manufactured pretext, just herself, the wine, and the uncomplicated fact that she wanted to be on the other side of that door. Patrick opened it. He looked at her. He looked at the wine. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, not the careful neutrality she'd come to expect from him, but something quieter and less defended than either. Recognition, maybe, or the particular look of someone who had been hoping for something without letting themselves admit it. He opened the door wider. They stayed in his kitchen until midnight, and then moved to the living room and stayed until 2. It wasn't the kind of conversation you plan. It was the kind that begins with something small. She made a comment about the wine. He disagreed with the specific precision of someone who knows the subject well, but has no interest in being credited for it, and then opens, layer by layer, without either person asking permission to continue. The hours moved the way hours do when no one is watching them, not quickly, not slowly, just gone by the time you think to check. He told her about New York, not with nostalgia, with the clinical honesty of someone who has already completed the grief of an entire life, and knows the precise difference between what was lost and what was chosen to be lost. You walked away from everything, she said. Not judgment, recognition. I walked away from what needed walking away from. But you were good. She had read the critical notices on the security sheet. You were more than good. Patrick turned his wineglass slowly in his hand. Still am. No arrogance, no performed humility, just fact, stated at room temperature. But there's dancing you do for an audience, and dancing you do because you can't not do it. I lost the first kind. The second kind was never something I was going to lose. There is a version of a thing you do to be seen, refined for the room, calibrated for reception, shaped by the awareness of eyes on you. And then there is the version that exists when the room is empty, when no one is watching, when the only reason to do it is because the alternative is not doing it, and that's no alternative at all. Most people only ever develop one version. The ones who carry both are built differently, and you can usually tell if you pay attention which version you're watching. She was quiet for a moment. The people here, she said finally, they have no idea who you actually are, do they? They have an idea of who they need me to be. He said it without bitterness, which was, in its own way, heavier than if there had been bitterness. That's easier that way for them. For you, he looked at her, I learned not to need people to get me right. She understood that there was something in that sentence that was more than philosophy. It was the language of someone who had stopped expecting accuracy from people who had never been genuinely curious, who had made peace with being misread, not because it stopped mattering, but because the alternative was an ongoing expenditure he could no longer afford. It was the language of scar tissue. They think you're gay, she said directly. I know. And you let them. It's easier than explaining that I'm a man who hasn't brought anyone home in 6 years because he was caring for his father, then grieving, then rebuilding. A pause. He said it without self-pity, which made it land with considerably more weight than self-pity would have. Explaining is exhausting. Letting people believe what they want is less exhausting. Cristina looked at him across the low lamplight. She knew that exhaustion. Not the same shape, but the same principle. The same specific weariness of a person who had spent too long being misread by people who had no genuine interest in reading her correctly. The energy it takes to keep correcting the record. The point at which you stop, not because you've accepted the misreading, but because you've decided the people doing it aren't worth the correction. I do that too, she said, without having planned to say it. I know. How do you know? Because you knocked on my door the one night you didn't have the energy to do anything differently. He didn't say it to wound her. He said it the way he said most things, as observation, clean and without ornament, and then went straight back to the armor. The word landed in the silence with a specific weight. Armor. She had the counter-arguments assembled and ready before the word had finished settling. She didn't wear armor. She was simply herself. This was simply who she was. There was nothing to protect, because there was nothing exposed. The logic was sound. She had used it many times before, and it had always held. But Patrick Pompeo was looking at her with that particular quality of attention that didn't ask her to be anything other than exactly what she was. And it was precisely that, the complete absence of demand, that made pretending impossible. You can maintain a position against pressure. You cannot maintain it against someone who isn't applying any. You're not wrong, she said. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it, denser, carrying the specific weight of things unsaid that were very close to being said. Patrick set his glass on the table. He moved closer, not abruptly, with that characteristic slowness of his, the body of someone who had learned through years of physical discipline that timing is everything, and rushing is its own kind of damage. The kiss didn't happen. It came within 2 centimeters of happening. She could feel the warmth radiating off him, could hear the slight shift in his breathing, was aware with uncomfortable precision of the exact distance between them, and then he stopped, held still for a moment. I don't want to be another mistake, he said, low, careful. What does that mean? It means you're in the middle of adrenaline, a major case, a threat against you, everything running at a volume that's too high. He didn't pull back, but he didn't move forward either. He occupied that 2-centimeter distance with the patience of someone who had learned to live in the space between impulse and action. And I'd rather not be the convenient neighbor you reach for when you're frightened and forget about when the fear passes. There are people who protect you from yourself, not condescendingly, not with the superior air of someone who believes they know better, but with the plain honesty of someone who simply sees you clearly and cares enough to say the true thing instead of the easy one. Patrick Pompeo was that kind of person. And Cristina Wilson, sitting in his living room at 2 in the morning, hated and loved that about him with exactly equal and simultaneous force. She stood, picked up her coat, crossed to the door. "Good night, Patrick." "Good night, Cristina." She didn't look back. She had enough self-preservation left for that. She went to the elevator, stepped in, pulled the metal gate closed with its familiar rattle. And when the elevator began its descent, her eyes burned. One tear, just one. She didn't allow another, pressed the back of one finger against the corner of her eye with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has had years of experience deciding exactly how much of herself she will spend in any given moment. But it stayed on the mirror of the elevator long enough that she had no choice but to face what it meant. He was right. He had seen her more clearly in 6 weeks than people who had known her for years, and she could add that to the growing list of things about Patrick Pompeo that she had absolutely no idea what to do with. And that was what hurt most. 2 weeks later, the case broke open, not the way she'd expected. Federal cases rarely break the way you expect them to. It broke sideways. One of the primary sources, pressured by the network under investigation, recanted, withdrew the testimony, threatened to sue the office for coercion. The preliminary hearing was in 4 days. Cristina spent 72 hours at the office, slept 3 of them, 8 enough to function. She rebuilt the evidentiary chain in a form that didn't depend on the withdrawn testimony, and she managed it, because this was precisely the kind of work she had been built for, the kind that required not inspiration, but endurance, not brilliance, but the willingness to stay at the desk after everyone else had gone home and treat the problem as a question that simply hadn't been answered yet. But when she walked through her door on Thursday evening, the adrenaline was gone. What remained was the silent apartment, and the particular weight of exhaustion that settles differently once urgency has left the building, and the 2 dried lavender stems on the kitchen windowsill that she still hadn't thrown away. Their color faded now to a pale, dusty gray, but still faintly, stubbornly present. She stood in the middle of the living room for a moment. Then her phone vibrated. A message, a number she knew by heart now. 2 words, "Still here." She stood with the phone in her hand and read it twice, the apartment quiet around her, the city doing its indifferent Thursday evening outside the window. She crossed to the window and looked down. On the street below, a figure stood near the building, still looking up, coffee in hand, with the unhurried ease of someone taking the night air, as though this was simply where he had happened to end up, and not a choice made with full awareness of what it meant. Patrick. She couldn't have said afterward who moved first. Perhaps both of them simultaneously, her coming down, him coming in. Him. They met in the second-floor corridor with the specific quality of 2 bodies that have spent too long resisting a pull and have finally, simply, stopped. "You heard," she said. "Saw the news." He stood 1 meter away. "You okay?" "I am." She took a step toward him. "Why are you here?" "Because last time I said the right thing and you left, and I spent 2 weeks wondering if I should have saved the right thing for later. Direct, no performance around it. The particular honesty that tends to cost more than most people are prepared to pay, and that he offered anyway, without adjusting the price. There are moments when the most courageous thing a person can do is simply show up. No plan, no strategy, no prepared speech, just presence, and the willingness to absorb whatever consequences that presence brings with it. No argument, however well constructed, carries the same weight as a person standing in a corridor at night because they decided that being there mattered more than being safe. Patrick Pompeo showed up, and in that hallway, that meant more than anything he could have said. Cristina looked at him. "You were right," she said. "That night. You were right, and I knew it, and I left because leaving was easier than admitting it." "I know. But it isn't a mistake." She took another step. "It isn't adrenaline or fear or something that evaporates when the case is over. It's you being exactly who you are in an elevator hallway at 7 in the morning without trying to be anything. And I don't know how to do this. Showing up without a strategy, without a prepared position, without knowing in advance how it ends. But I'm here anyway." Patrick was quiet for a second. Then he crossed the meter between them. He didn't say anything. He brought both hands up to her face, slowly with that deliberateness that was the signature of everything he did, as though speed were a form of carelessness he had long ago decided against, and held still, looking at her, the way someone looks at a thing they want to be certain is real before they do anything that can't be undone. And then he did the next thing. The kiss was exactly what 2 months of tension had been quietly promising it would be. Slow at first, carrying that quality of recognition that kisses have when they arrive simultaneously too late and precisely on time. Her hands went to his chest. His hands moved into her hair. The hallway, the building, the old city outside, all of it receded to a soft peripheral hum, the way the world does when something inside it suddenly takes up all the available space. Charleston continued outside, as indifferent and beautiful as ever. But in the second-floor corridor of a historic building on East Bay Street, 2 people who had spent their lives constructing very different kinds of walls were finally unmistakably standing on the same side of them. There is a specific kind of arrival, not the kind with luggage and an itinerary, but the kind where you show up to another person with nothing but your own willingness to be there. No insurance policy, no exit route mapped in advance. Just intention, plain and unadorned, offered without the guarantee of how it will be received. It is the most vulnerable form of courage there is. Not the courage of the courtroom or the stage, the courage of the corridor at night with nothing prepared. Cristina Wilson, who had prepared for everything for as long as she could remember, arrived without preparation. And it turned out that was exactly the right way to come. When the kiss ended, she rested her forehead against his. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere below them, the old building settled into itself with a soft, wooden sound, the way it had been settling for 100 years. "What about the neighbors?" she said softly, a trace of humor in it, fragile and warm. He was quiet for a second. "What neighbors?" he said. She laughed, and Patrick Pompeo, who didn't smile easily and didn't laugh without reason, laughed too. The sound of it was low and unguarded, and entirely unperformed, and it filled the corridor the way warmth fills a room that has been cold for too long, not all at once, but completely. That night, the apartment held a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of before, the functional distance 2 people maintain and call mutual respect. This was the silence of after, the kind that exists when there is nothing left to negotiate, no position left to defend, no exit route being quietly mapped in the back of the mind. The air in the room had changed its quality entirely, the way air does after a long-held breath is finally released. Cristina sat on the sofa, shoes on the floor, wineglass in hand. Patrick stood at the center of the room. That deliberate empty space she now understood as an extension of what he was, not simply habit or workspace. She looked at it differently now. She looked at everything in this apartment differently now. "Show me," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "What you do when you're alone, in the morning. What I saw." To ask someone to show you the version of themselves that was never prepared to be seen, that is among the most intimate requests one person can make of another. Not the body, not the history, not the carefully guarded secrets. The self that exists only in an empty room, when no gesture needs to earn approval, when the only audience is the air. To ask for that is to ask for the thing a person protects most carefully, precisely because it was never meant to be offered. Patrick stood still for a moment, then he crossed to his phone. He chose something. She didn't see what. The music that came through was instrumental, low, built in layers that you register less through your ears than through a shift somewhere in your chest, a settling, as though the sound were rearranging something internal without asking permission, and he began to move, Not toward her at first, toward the space, toward the music. His eyes closed briefly, the face of someone who has stopped performing and started inhabiting. And something in the room shifted with that small surrender, the way a conversation shifts when someone finally says the true thing. Cristina set the wine glass down without noticing she'd done it. She watched the way his shoulders released, the tension she hadn't realized he always carried dissolving under the music, like something that had only been waiting for permission. The low lamp caught the line of his jaw, the movement of his hands, the unhurried certainty of a body that knew exactly what it was doing and had stopped apologizing for it. There was nothing performative in it. That was what undid her. The complete absence of performance, the radical honesty of a person in motion who had forgotten for the moment that he was being watched. But then gradually the movement changed direction. Toward her. He opened his eyes, and the way he looked at her, steady, direct, with that quality of attention that had been quietly dismantling her defenses since the first day in the hallway, was different from any look that had come before it. This one made no pretense of neutrality. This one said something she hadn't been ready to hear then, and was only barely ready to hear now. Cristina didn't move. Couldn't. Quite. Something was happening in this room that existed entirely outside the vocabulary she had spent her life building. Not art, not performance, not seduction in any of the forms she had learned to recognize and categorize and keep at a manageable distance. It was simpler than any of those things, and considerably more dangerous. A person moving through space toward her, as though she were the specific destination the music had always been pointing toward. Patrick came close, stopped in front of her, extended his hand. The lamp threw amber across his features. She was aware, with that uncomfortable, full-body clarity she had been trying to manage since the morning she'd found him shirtless in this same room, of the exact distance between them, of the warmth radiating off him, of the fact that her heart was doing something her professional composure had absolutely no protocol for. She looked at his hand for 1 second, and then she took it. He drew her up slowly, and she rose, and when she was standing the distance between them was considerably less than it had been on the sofa, and she felt that proximity the way you feel a change in weather, in the chest first, then everywhere else. He didn't try to teach her anything, didn't attempt to turn the moment into a lesson. He simply began to move with her, slowly, one hand at the small of her back with a pressure that was light but deliberate, specific, the hand of someone who knew exactly where it was and had chosen to be there. And she, who had not danced with any sincerity in her entire adult life, discovered that the body carries knowledge the mind never bothers to learn. His cheek was close to her temple. She could feel the warmth of his breath, slow and even, and the steadiness of it against the unsteadiness she was working hard not to show. The hand at her back shifted, barely, a matter of centimeters, and the adjustment sent something quiet and insistent through her that she was completely unprepared for and entirely unwilling to examine too closely. "You didn't say you couldn't dance," he said. His voice was lower than usual, close enough that she felt it as much as heard it. "I can't. You're dancing right now." She lifted her face to look at him. The distance between their faces was not a distance that allowed for neutral expression. She could see the particular darkness of his eyes in the amber light, the slight unevenness of his breathing that told her the steadiness was costing him something too. That knowledge, that she was not alone in this, that the careful control was not effortless on his side either, moved through her like a current finding ground. They were close enough that pretense had nowhere left to stand, and it was she who reached up and took the collar of his shirt, her fingers curling into the fabric with a quiet certainty that surprised her, the decision arriving not from her mind, but from somewhere older and considerably less manageable. She who closed the remaining distance. And the kiss that happened this time was different from the one in the corridor, not the release of 2 months of tension finally giving way, but the kiss of two people who have already been through the first one and now understand that there is more, that they want more, that they are choosing more with full awareness of what that means. It deepened the way inevitabilities do, gradually, then completely. His hands at her waist drew her closer, and the small sound she made against his mouth was something she would have been embarrassed by if she'd had any embarrassment left to spend. Her fingers went into his hair. His hands moved with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, unhurried, attentive, learning her the way he had learned the music, as though there were no reason to rush through something worth understanding properly. The music continued somewhere in the room. They had stopped hearing it entirely. The Charleston night came through the open window as a breeze, salt air threaded through with magnolia, the distant sounds of the old city going about its ancient, indifferent business. The amber lamp threw soft light and long shadows across the performance photographs on the walls, the faces in those frames, watching with their permanent frozen expressions of mid-movement. And in the second-floor apartment, two people finally allowed themselves what they had been quietly building toward since the day an old elevator rattled its metal gate shut between two floors of a historic building on East Bay Street. It wasn't perfect. Nothing real ever is. She said wait once, and he waited without making it into anything. He said like this twice, showing her, and she learned. There was a moment when she laughed, the specific laugh of nerves releasing, of relief, of the good strangeness of something genuinely new. And he went still and let her finish, and then continued as though the laughter were part of the thing rather than an interruption of it. Because it was. The best love stories are not about the absence of stumbling. They are about what happens when you stumble in front of someone, and they stay, and you stay. And both of you decide that the stumble is part of the story rather than an argument against it. Cristina Wilson had spent 35 years becoming too good at not stumbling in public, at maintaining the smooth, controlled forward motion of someone who has pre-engineered the terrain. That night in Charleston, she stumbled, and Patrick Pompeo stayed. When the breeze cooled the room and the city outside settled into that specific Charleston quiet that exists between midnight and 3 in the morning, a hush so complete, it feels like the city is briefly, mercifully keeping its own counsel. Cristina lay with her head on his chest, listening. Beneath her hand, his heart was beating faster than its usual steady pace. She smiled, small, private, entirely her own. He was scared too. Patrick. I'm glad you didn't save the right thing for later. He didn't answer immediately. His hand moved through her hair, slowly, without purpose beyond its own presence, the gesture of someone who has nowhere else to be and no interest in being there. So am I, he said. Outside, Charleston continued its beautiful, indifferent existence, the harbor lights on the water, the cobblestones holding their centuries of memory, the magnolia-threaded air moving through streets that had seen everything and forgotten nothing. And inside the second-floor apartment, two people slept finally without walls between them. The silence around them no longer the silence of distance, but the deeper, warmer silence of two people who have, at last, arrived at the same place at the same time and chosen to stay. 4 months later. The January morning came through the white wooden shutters in slanted bars of gold, the kind of morning Charleston produces better than any city Cristina had ever lived in, cold enough to justify staying under the covers, clear enough that the light did all the work the city needed it to do. She was at the kitchen table, a new case file open in front of her, coffee at her elbow, pen turning between her fingers in the distracted rhythm that meant she was actually reading and not merely moving her eyes across the page. From the other side of the wall, the familiar sound. Low music. The movement of Patrick's body through the empty room. Not choreography this time. She had learned to tell the difference. This was what he did when his mind was somewhere else entirely. Movement as breathing. The body thinking in its own language while the rest of him was elsewhere. She knew his sounds now, all of them. They hadn't announced anything to the neighbors. Sandra had her suspicions. Cristina could see it in her eyes during corridor mornings, the look of someone who has revised the narrative but hasn't yet decided how to present the new version. Jorge had made one ambiguous comment that neither of them had responded to. There was nothing to explain, and neither of them felt the absence of an explanation. There is a phase in a relationship that almost never appears in stories. Not the first kiss, not the first night, not the grand declaration that arrives with appropriate weather. The phase that comes after all of that, when the adrenaline of beginning has settled, and what remains is the ordinary texture of two lives arranging themselves around each other. The coffee made the way you take it without you having asked, the understanding that he needs silence before 10 in the morning, and you give it without drama, the gradual, astonishing discovery that sharing space with another person can be the most intimate thing that exists, more intimate sometimes than the large moments that get remembered and retold. It is the intimacy of the unremarkable, the kind that only accumulates with time and only means something because of what it cost to get there. Cristina Wilson was in that phase, and she hadn't known it was something that could exist for her. Patrick came into the kitchen with his hair undone and reached for what remained in the coffee pot, the last of it, always the last of it, because she always arrived first. He never complained. She had started leaving a little more deliberately without saying so. He had started drinking a little less for the same reason, without saying so either. The small adjustments of two people learning each other's edges without making a project of it. He leaned against the counter, looking out the kitchen window at the street below. The two dried lavender stems were still on the sill. She had never thrown them away, and he had never once mentioned them. They had simply remained, pale and dry and present, like a footnote to a conversation that had never needed to be finished. "Hearing today?" he asked. 2:00. She turned a page without lifting her eyes. "Should be done before 5. I have rehearsal at 7. New company, collaborative project." A pause. "Back by 10. "Okay." This is what real intimacy looks like from the inside, not the grand gesture, not the declaration made in the rain, but two calendars beginning, almost imperceptibly, to account for each other. The way his schedule becomes information you carry without being asked to carry it. The way yours becomes a shape he moves around without either of you having negotiated the arrangement. No announcement, no agreement, just the quiet, daily evidence of two people who have decided, without ceremony, that the other person's life matters to the planning of their own. The silence that followed was the comfortable kind, not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who have stopped needing to fill the air with sound in order to prove they are present. After a moment, Cristina closed the case file. She looked at him. Patrick was looking out the window, coffee in hand, wearing that quiet and present expression she had spent 4 months learning to read. Not distant. Here, fully, unhurriedly here, the way he was in everything he did. She watched him for a moment longer than he realized. There was something she had been carrying for 4 months, not as a weight but as a warmth, a thing she had turned over quietly, in the margins of early mornings and late nights, in the space between one case and the next, something she had been waiting without fully admitting she was waiting for the right moment to return. "Patrick," he turned. She set the pen down, stood up from the table, unhurried, deliberate, in the way she had learned from him, and crossed the small kitchen until she was close enough that he straightened slightly, reading her the way he always read her, completely, without pretense of doing anything else. She reached up and placed one hand against the side of his face. His expression shifted, not with surprise, but with that particular quality of attention he reserved for the moments he understood were significant. His hand came to rest over hers instinctively, fingers wrapping loosely around her wrist, holding without holding. "That night," she said quietly, "when I came to your door and sat in your lap and fell apart completely." She felt the slight change in his breathing beneath her palm. "You put your hand on my back, and you said something." He waited, his eyes on hers, steady, warm, carrying 4 months of mornings and late dinners and corridor silences, and the slow, irreversible accumulation of someone becoming essential. "I've thought about those words every day since," she said, "not because I needed them to make sense anymore." She held his gaze, "but because I wanted to be someone who could give them back." The kitchen went very still. She leaned in, slowly, with the same deliberateness he had always brought to the distance between them, and spoke the words quietly against the warmth of his jaw, close enough that they were less sound than breath. "You don't have to be strong right now, I'm here." The silence that followed had weight and texture, and a warmth that filled the room the way January light fills a small kitchen. Completely, without fanfare, as though it had always belonged there. Patrick didn't move for a moment. Then his arms came around her, not the careful one-handed restraint of that first night, but fully, the embrace of someone who has stopped managing the distance and has no intention of reinstating it. His mouth found her temple, her hair. the particular quiet of a man who has learned that some things don't require words and has made his peace with that completely. She stayed where she was, her face against his neck, his heartbeat steady under her ear, faster than usual, she noted, with the private satisfaction of a woman who had spent her career reading the evidence that people tried to hide and had become, in this specific case, entirely glad she still could. Later that morning, after the hearing, after the rehearsal, after Charleston did once more what it does at night with the harbor lights scattering across the water, they were on his balcony. Quiet. Shoulders touching. Her coffee gone cold in her hand because she had stopped noticing it. From the corridor came the sound of Sandra passing with the orange cat. She stopped, looked at the two of them, and Cristina watched with precise clarity the exact moment Sandra revised 4 months of incorrect narrative in the span of a single second. The small, private recalibration visible in the eyes before the face could arrange itself into something more composed. The older woman gave that particular nod, the nod of someone who has decided graciously not to comment, and went into her own apartment. Patrick looked at Cristina. Cristina looked at Patrick, and both of them, simultaneously, without coordination, looked away, shoulders shaking. Neither willing to be the first one to make it audible. This is how it ends. Not with fireworks, not with a public declaration or a grand gesture performed for an audience. With two silhouettes on a historic Charleston balcony, shoulder to shoulder, laughing at the same thing without needing to explain why it's funny. The neighbor everyone said was gay, who was, in fact, a man who had quietly dismantled a 12-year career in one of the world's great cities to sit beside a dying father, and then stayed when the reason for staying was gone, rebuilding himself slowly, without announcement, in the city that had always known his name. The prosecutor who had never let anyone get close, who had confused the absence of need with the presence of strength, and who learned in the corridor of an old building on a Thursday night that the bravest thing she had ever done was knock on a door with nothing prepared, and a whisper on a night of desperation that changed the angle of everything, spoken once in fear and returned 4 months later in love. The same words, entirely different ground beneath them. What this story made me think about is simple. We are so fluent in the language of what people appear to be. We read the surface and write the story before we've been given the pages. Patrick was filed away. Cristina was filed away. Neither of them was what anyone said they were. Both of them were entirely, stubbornly, quietly themselves, waiting without knowing they were waiting, for the one person who would be curious enough to look past the first impression and patient enough to stay for what came after. That's what love requires, I think. Not grand courage, the smaller kind, the willingness to keep looking at someone until you actually see them. End.